Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Stephen King podcast. This is bonus episode number 47, and I have with me today comic book writer Chris Denmead. Hello, Chris. How you doing?
Denmead.
Denmead. My apologies. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Not too bad. So you've got quite a few pokers in the fire, but primarily we want to talk today about your comic book, Vlada, which is a different take on the Dracula mythos. But before we get into that, why don't you tell the readers a little bit about yourselves?
I live in Massachusetts, in the New England, which is in New England.
Okay.
And so I'm between Worcester and Boston, which are the two big cities.
Right.
I've been writing off and on for the last 10 years, and vampires seems to be the biggest thing that I've written. Mm-hmm. Vlada has been the most successful thing that I have written.
Okay.
We did it and last year during COVID as a Kickstarter with my artist, Ken Hunt. But before that, I've been on the radio for 14 years in Worcester.
Okay, very good. And what kind of radio do you do?
It's a horror-themed radio show.
Very cool. And do you cover everything? Movies, books?
Yeah, if it's related to the horror industry, we'll cover it, including music and toys. We dabble into science fiction and fantasy as well when it's necessary or it's popular enough to talk about it.
Okay.
And play a lot of music from those industries as well. So not just horror movies, but also sci-fi and fantasy, and then rock and metal on the airways with the whatever it is we happen to be playing.
Very cool. And is this a live air show, or is it streamed, or like how do you get this out to the people?
It's broadcast on the dial in Worcester, 91.3 FM, and then it streams at the same time.
Okay.
And then I cut interviews out of the music just because the music's all copywritten, and I don't want YouTube and all these other problems that people have with music being played, even though it's just in promotion of them to come after me. So we cut up the interviews and put that up separately.
Okay, very cool. I'll include all that info in the show notes for that. So if people want to listen to your show, they can do that. So let's talk a little bit about how you got to where you are. Education-wise, did you take radio broadcasting type courses, media courses, or how did you fall into that?
The show started in 2007, but no. To answer basically all that in one giant no, I didn't do.
Okay. So what was your educational background then?
High school, I did not go to college.
Okay. That's fine. No problem. And so how did you fall into the radio thing then?
It was through happenstance,
mm-hmm.
just a festival on the street, and they were looking for new DJs.
Okay. And something obviously sparked for you and launched a whole new path for you.
Yep.
All right. So that's very good. Now, in terms of writing, did you always have the creative bug to write as well, or?
Off and on, but really difficult time focusing entirely on it. So
mm-hmm.
it kind of hit or miss. And then when in my 30s, that's when I really started getting into it and getting stuff published and written, either through self-publishing or
mm-hmm.
short stories, things like that. The Vlada comic book that we just put out 2 weeks ago,
mm-hmm.
Separate from the graphic novel, The Chronicle of the Damned, that was the 5th or 6th comic book or graphic novel that I've published or gotten published.
Okay.
Which is nothing, that is an insanely small number that's just a single digit number compared to obviously the hundreds of thousands or dozens that people have done before me.
Sure.
It's not a huge, I would like it to be a bigger number, but it's just a matter of like what I have been focusing on
mm-hmm.
and what I've wanted to do. And I'm hoping this will lead to the next project to get done, which I'm not going to get into too much just because we're focused on.
Okay. So you're obviously self-taught then. Were you a big reader?
Yes. I read and gobble up most books that I find interesting. I'm
mm-hmm.
not a classic literature person, but I will read it if I find it fascinating
mm-hmm.
or if someone puts it in my hand. I read a ton of comic books and graphic novels, so that's where my focus has been.
Okay.
Books, novels, things like that have been regulated to audiobooks lately just because it's just been easier to consume those.
Sure.
And it's led to me publishing 7 audiobooks.
Cool.
One of which is Vlada as an audiobook, the graphic novel that you've seen. That became an audiobook, but also 6 erotic rom-com audiobooks.
Mm.
So that's a whole other story.
I'm sure it is.
None of them are read by me, by the way. These are all, I'm the producer, editor, writer, transcriber of these. They're all actually narrated by women.
Okay, very cool. And it's interesting then that I guess based on what you were reading on comic books and whatnot, and were your stories all horror based or genre, or did you write across genres at all? Or
yeah, everything I've written other than articles and poems, which I count to be completely separate,
mm-hmm.
and a lot of those articles are horror related. Most of it is horror related,
mm-hmm.
not all necessarily vampire related. There's only one thing coming up in the future that won't be horror related. It's a biography book, and it's not related to the horror genre at all.
Okay, interesting. So did you have any favorite writers that you go back to, or if a comic book or otherwise?
Yeah, if you look at the very beginning of Vlada, A Dracula Tale,
mm-hmm.
the very beginning of Vlada, I attribute the book to the late, great Jack Dallas Ketchum.
Okay, yep. Yeah.
Are you familiar with who he was?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Jack was a close friend of mine. He had been my most guest on my show for many years. He died of cancer in 2018,
mm-hmm.
his second fortunate bout with cancer.
Right.
And he was a huge influence on me to pursue writing more diligently, because he didn't start his writing career until he was in his 50s, but he was a book manager for a number of years.
Mm.
And I love talking to him and hearing his stories. And he was just a huge inspiration. I mean, I love Stephen King as well. And I love
mm-hmm.
the late, great Anne Rice, who just passed away the day before we're recording this. A lot of comic book authors and writers as well. John Bellairs is a New England author who passed away many years ago before I even really knew who he was, whose books were all illustrated by Edward Gorey. He was a huge influence on me as well. He was a New England-based author.
Okay.
And he also... The House with the Clock in Its Walls was a movie that was made based on one of his novels. I think it's the only one actually based on one of his novels. But that was a massive influence of mine as a child before I discovered Stephen King or met Jack.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, I'm quite familiar with Jack. I've read several of his books. Of course, his most famous is The Girl Next Door, which is that's
right.
That yes,
that is a horror story. That is a true horror story. That's not like a Freddy story or Jason or a vampire story. That is a true horrific story. More of a
mm-hmm.
That's probably the best way to describe it. It's a thriller, but it's a horrific story, and it is in the horror genre. I mean, what is done in that book, and I do not want to get into it. It is probably the most horrific thing to ever happen to someone.
Yeah, for sure.
And anyone who's never seen it before, don't confuse it with the lucky high schooler who moves next door to a performance star.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
And when he turns 18, gets to take her to the dance and then eventually have sex with her.
Yeah.
Not the same story.
No, not by any stretch of the imagination.
It's just funny they both came out at the same time. Both movies came out roughly around the same time.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well,
coincidence.
Yeah. Okay, so you obviously are well versed in horror and so forth. And Anne Rice, who you mentioned, who just passed away as we're recording this on December 12th. I was a big fan of hers. You know, her obviously her Vampire Lestat series was pretty fantastic, and I also enjoyed the Cleopatra Ramsey series as well. So I'm looking. I don't know. There was going to be a third book. I don't know. I guess I don't know how far along that was or not. But because she was writing with her son near the end as well. So maybe something.
Yeah, the inevitable television show that will never, ever come out. I mean, if it does now, it's because the executives want to capitalize on her passing, but I'll be shocked if it does. I mean, that TV show has been in development hell for a decade. Literally a decade, or possibly more, since the last movie came out. I just cannot believe how long it's taken. You can put out as much of the vampire crap as you've been able to put out, Hollywood, but you can't get that.
Yeah.
This is like trying to get Tim Seeley's Hack Slash made into a actual... television show.
It's weird how some projects just stay in development hell for so long, and then there's other projects that are so much lesser that just seem to get fast tracked
and then canceled after one season, like Netflix Cowboy Bebop just did this weekend.
Yeah, for sure. So, well, that's why they call it show business and not to show friends. So let's turn now to, like, you've obviously have a predilection for vampires. So how did that come about?
It probably goes to Anne Rice. I was just telling someone today that she was probably the first adult novel I ever read in my life when I was 10 or 11 years old, probably 10 years old. It was Interview with the Vampire. Mm-hmm. But before that, it was most likely movies. But vampires have always been a thing in my life in one way or another.
Right. Did you ever see the movie with Darren McGavin, the Night Stalker?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have the Blu-rays for both movies and now the really recently released Blu-ray television show, and had conversations with Mark DeWiziak, I think his last name is pronounced, who's the author of the Kolchak Companion.
Yeah, well, I'm of the age that I was at the perfect age when that movie first premiered. So that was that, and the Salem's Lot miniseries, the Danny Glick scene at the window. Those imprinted vampires on me for sure, and then the Anne Rice books that I followed up with later. So I can understand the fascination with it, and it's a very malleable mythos because I've had guests on previously that have also done things with Dracula as well. So I'm curious to what you've done with it, and I assume part of that is lies in the title.
Yeah, and it's funny you said Salem's Lot. They're filming the new adaptation of Salem's Lot here in Massachusetts, or they've finished filming.
Right. Yeah. Look, I'll be interested to see how that turns out. So far, the track record on the new adaptations hasn't been that great. I wasn't impressed with Pet Sematary or the new Stand or the recent Stand miniseries either. So cross our fingers that this one turns out better.
Right, but Sleep. What is it called? Doctor Sleep was a sleeper hit that everyone eventually saw when it came to streaming on disc, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, this was an amazing movie."
Yes,
but nobody saw it in theaters. And both chapters to it, when you watch it together, I think makes a much better movie than the way they broke it up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I much preferred part one over part two. But yeah. And Dr. Sleep, Mike Flanagan, the guy is, man, if there's anybody that would adapt a Stephen King work right now, before it would have been Frank Darabont or maybe Rob Reiner, but now Mike Flanagan's the guy. And he's thrown his hat in the ring for The Dark Tower. So who knows? Maybe down the road, we'll see what happens there. But let's talk about your Vlada. What's that all about?
We gender swap the cast of Dracula.
Okay. All the way through?
Mm-hmm. Oh, every character.
Every character. Wow. And is it set in the original timeline, or is it modern day, or?
No, there's no way to set that in the original timeline if you gender swap the cast of women, because women did two things back then. They were teachers or nurses. They were not, a teacher could be a professor, a teacher could be a school mistress, a teacher could be a principal, if that term even existed back then. I'm not 100% certain.
Mm-hmm.
A teacher could be, an Oxford professor, which is fine. But let's just face it, there were not a lot of doctor women. There's Dr. Quinn, but that's fiction. Mm-hmm. But there's not a lot of we needed to move the timeline along a little bit without saying exactly when it takes place. The biggest complaint that I've had about the book was I didn't know where it took place. And I was like, that's the point. But I appreciate everything else you said. I was like, is that your only complaint? It's not a complaint. I just didn't understand when it took place. And I'm like, exactly. Because she's like, you mentioned a cell phone, but they take boats and carriages. Like, right. Never seen Batman the Animated Series? He has a computer, but everyone dresses like it's the 40s.
Oh, okay. Cool. Very cool.
So I needed to make sure that we set it in a time period that made sense with like women's roles, because otherwise I have all these women in different roles that are not making a lot of sense back then. Unfortunately was not, society was not as progressive as it is, as much as it is trying to be today.
Right.
And I also needed to gender swap. I also needed to make the cast not completely white. And most stuff in fiction and movies, literature, it's all white. And that is of the time period. I'm not going to say if it's wrong. I'm just going to say it was the time period.
Yeah.
So it was like, somebody needs to be different. I'm going to make Van Helsing black. Why? Because I love Gina Torres from Firefly, and I've always been in love with Zoe. And guess what? I've always wanted to be like, if I ever do something, I'm going to base a character on Zoe from Firefly, because Gina Torres, oh my God. And I did that, and that's Van Helsing. And we homage it in a couple of great pictures in the book. If you have the PDF, there's a picture of the Lucy character Luke rising from the tomb, and that's actually taken directly from Bernie Wrightson's Frankenstein book, which we just found out some cool information about. That piece of artwork is going to be involved in something later on. I don't know if I can get into too much, but that's why a lot of the artwork, a lot of people say, it looks like Bernie Wrightson. And I'm like, did you read the front of the book? They read the front of the book. Oh, for Bernie Wrightson, I see. So the artwork is a giant homage to Bernie Wrightson. Oh, okay. And that's kind of what it's doing. Cool. That's why we decided not to do a comic book and do a graphic novella. And the novella is basically because the novel's over 100 pages, and the novella is under 100 pages.
Right. So this story has been released in several different ways. Did I understand correctly? You said it was a comic book and a graphic novel, or?
There's just the graphic novel and the audiobook, and then the comic book is a side piece. There's 2 comic book tie-ins to it.
Okay.
So there's actually 4 parts to it. There's 5 parts to it. I forgot about a short film I did in 2014. So the short film in 2014 was supposed to be part of a Kickstarter for a movie, which we needed a budget of $10,000, and we didn't get it. It was an epic failure on Kickstarter. We only raised $800 of $10,000, which is an epic effing failure on a Kickstarter. So that didn't happen. So the short film hung around in development for a while. The short film hung around while the film hung around development hell for a while. Right after the film was a complete disaster, I moved on to a prequel comic book in 2016. And then that was a mediocre, not success. And then I moved on to the graphic novel during the pandemic last year with me and Ken Hunt, the artist, along with like Matt Slay, Wendy Sheener, and Tim Vigil, the great Tim Vigil of 45 years of comic book legend and fame. And AZ Power Girl, the cosplayer, and Jessica Gowd, and then Tim Seeley, who's a creator of Hackslash, and Veronica Kim as variant cover artist or whatever. And then me and Ken and Tim Vigil did another comic book this past October, right after the graphic novel came out. But between the graphic novel and the second comic book, there was the audiobook with Diana Porter, who's a New England actress.
Okay. So I got a couple of questions now. First off,
so just to give you the timeline of everything.
Yes, this is great because I've been asking the guests who's come on the show in the last year how COVID has affected them, and it sounds like you were working on this project during the COVID lockdown, the first one. Did COVID inform or change your story in any way?
The only thing that changed was Ken said that, I know you don't want to do 3 different Kickstarters. What if we did this as one graphic novel homaging Bernie Wrightson's Frankenstein? Bernie Wrightson's Frankenstein was a comic book Marvel published in the 1970s, I believe, I think prior to him doing Swamp Thing, but I might be wrong on the timeline, and viewers can probably leave comments, and that's fine. I don't have the history of Bernie Wrightson in front of me. I'm just going based on what I remember.
Right.
He took the novel of Frankenstein, took 5 years, I think something like that, to draw 55 brand new illustrations for the novel of Frankenstein, published it in a giant hardcover, and then did a sequel called Frankenstein Alive Alive with Steve Niles, the creator of 30 Days a Night, many years later, as a sequel to it. And that was a fully illustrated comic book. But he did the graphic novel, which is basically, again, the story of Frankenstein from beginning to end by Mary Shelley, but then threw in 55 illustrations into the books. Stuff people had never seen before.
Cool.
And we wanted to do kind of the same thing, homaging Bernie with Frankenstein. I had met Bernie Wrightson. Ken had met Bernie Wrightson. So that is a big homage to him. And because you're doing a Stephen King podcast, Bernie Wrightson was the illustrator for what book?
Cycle of the Werewolf.
The Stand.
The Stand.
Sure.
Oh.
Yeah, Cycle of the Werewolf too, I think. Yes, but I was going to say The Stand because that's I have my copy of The Stand signed by Bernie Wrightson.
Ah, okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah. So that was like, I said, sure, let's do that. And we did it as the graphic novel contained.
Okay.
We had 8 variant covers because you cannot do a Kickstarter with one cover for a comic book. If you can't do it, you will fail epically.
Okay.
And anyone I've seen, and there is no Kickstarter I've ever seen done for a comic book or a graphic novel with one cover. People do multiple covers. And if you have women in your comic book, you're going to do the gauntlet of covers containing PG to triple X to R sometimes. I've seen covers that I'm like, oh my God, look at all the boobs. And it sells Kickstarters. I hate to sound like it's a chauvinist thing, but Kickstarter comic books sell because cheesecake sells.
I don't suppose you know the breakdown of subscribers in terms of gender.
No. I mean, I guess legally I'm not even allowed to disclose my own gender demographic on Kickstarter, but I don't think Kickstarter asks you for your gender. It's been a long time since I filled out my profile, so I'm not 100% certain. But we had a fairly decent amount of women buy the book too.
Interesting.
I only had 1 or 2 people being like, boobs, really? Camel toe with the bikini, Chris? And I'm like, okay, listen, that was something else, and we changed it into Vlada. That's why. And Ken has 2 covers. He has the regular cover you see where she's coming down the staircase, and then we have another cover where she's in a pool of blood wearing a bikini, and someone points out there's a little bit of nipplage and camel toe, but it's all covered. You know what I mean? It's still a thing you could stick on a shelf and don't have to cover it up unless you're that much of a prude. None of the covers are nude until we did the retail cover with Veronica Kim, who's a Canadian female Asian artist who does manga stuff. And I said I wanted a nude cover. It's time to do a nude cover. Let's do a nude cover. She did one up for me. It looks beautiful. Vlada's holding a beating heart, taking a bite out of it, and the blood runs down between her lips, down between her breasts to her downstairs business. So, and we drew it all. We drew it all, but we drew it very like Michelangelo's David. You know what I mean? You see a penis. It's not an elongated penis. It's just there. You know it's there. The same thing with her other business. So we kept it very, respectful. So, but I wanted a nude cover, and I wanted a female to draw it because I felt as though I always wanted a female to draw the book. That did not work out the way I wanted it to. Attempted, and it just didn't work out. And I finally went with Ken, and we got it together. But I wanted to make sure we had a variety of different people working on the covers, from men and women.
Your comics or graphic novels, are they color or black and white or a mixture?
The graphic novel, the 2 comic books, they're all black and white. The covers are color.
Okay. Now, I've had other comic book writers on, and I'm kind of fascinated by the whole comic book process because it's, most writing is a solo endeavor, whereas with comic books, you're working with at least an artist, maybe other people as well, but during the initial creation phase and that. So how did you work with your artist? Did you collaborate on the story with him, or did you say, this is the arc of the story I need, and how many panels were you guys aiming for as well? So can you tell me a little bit about that?
I didn't quite understand it because, again, the Vlada book itself is 80 pages with 24 illustrations in it.
Okay. So that was your target when you started writing that story. You had 80 pages with 24 panels or pictures. Do you knew that ahead of time?
Be a comic book, but he decided that it would best if we did this as the graphic novel, like Bernie Wrightson's Frankenstein.
Okay. So
are you familiar with Bernie Wrightson's Frankenstein?
I haven't seen it, no. But comic books or graphic novels, you are limited to a certain number of pictures or panels, whatever you refer to them as. So when you're writing your story, the two have to work together to tell a complete story, right? You can't write more words than you're going to illustrate, and he can't draw more than what the story dictates. So how did you guys work that out?
When it transitioned from being a comic book to the prose novel that it is, we basically took whatever we were. Well, first of all, everything had to be completely rewritten. Right. So it had to be rewritten as an actual book now, instead of the script for the comic book. Okay. Because the script for the comic book was 3 separate comics. And then it had everything had to be rewritten. And there were constant mistakes because a lot of stuff was being described in ways that sounded like it was going to be drawn. It wasn't anymore. It was going to be just a story narration, and we were going to insert pictures into it to describe what was going on. And then when we ran out of ideas for like X, Y, and Z happens on the page, X, Y, and Z is going to happen in the picture, we just threw in a beautiful Gothic artwork that just showcased something else in the story, not necessarily what was happening on page. Like there's a whole page of dialogue and people doing stuff that's kind of boring scene, but we threw in a picture of a bat because it looks awesome. We didn't need to describe Mark and Luke, who are the Mina and Lucy character, coming back from playing golf. Nobody wants to see a picture of that,
Right,
nobody. Sure. That's even in a comic book panel. It I guess it makes for the lull in the story to progress the characters and they meet Vlada, but not necessary.
Okay.
We followed it up with a picture of the Vlada creature now in the wolf form attacking Luke, like in Bram Stoker's Dracula, where Gary Oldman attacks Lucy and rapes her and bites her in that famous scene where he's like full on wolf form and she's in rapture. It's probably the most famous image from the movie, and can you believe it's actually been made into a statue?
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I'm not even joking. There's a statue of Dracula in his giant hairy form and Lucy on the slab of the mortuary.
Right.
Mina walks in on him.
Right.
She turns in 1 minute, he's there, and the next minute he's gone. Lucy's like in disheveled, half naked, and all like, oh, what happened? We didn't want to do that quite so graphic.
Sure.
So we still wanted to make sure that we showed Vlada had multiple forms, like a beast mode, a bat mode. She's hot and sexy through the entire book, but there's sometimes we wanted to make sure we captured the essence from the movie. Sorry, the book itself. We really tried to stay away from anything that happened in the movie, but we were going to cherry pick what we could from various forms, because Vlada is also a homage of like multiple vampire stories. Basically, it's my love of many things.
Oh, okay.
Castlevania, Dracula.
That was the question I was going to ask, is how closely did you follow the original Dracula story with this?
we follow the story beats itself. You know, like Van Helsing's mentioned to have been Dutch, so that's in the book.
Right.
We don't do the Dracula scaling down the wall. We throw in a new character in there who is a microscopic character in the book that it's not even a character. It's more like an object. Dracula gives the bride something to go feed on later on because he wants Jonathan Harker for himself. We do that with like a young village girl who eventually will become her own character through the book. So there is a new character introduced into the story. It is not our focus character like they do in Hellboy, which was really stupid with that FBI character being like, look, we need a human character for the audience to acknowledge and understand through the story because Hellboy is not enough of a character himself, I guess.
Right.
I created a new character for the story that I wanted to spin off into her own book.
Okay.
And she will spin off into her own book in 2023.
Very cool. Now, you mentioned that you crafted the story so you couldn't really pin down the time period in that. How did the gender swapping affect the story, or did it?
I mean, it did in a way that the women have unique voices. The guys have their own voices in the other story, but I feel like this gives Dracula's brides husbands now, because they were the brides, they're now the grooms, more to do.
Okay.
They don't do anything in that original novel in most versions of any movies. They're just sex on screen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they are just there to be like, look, there's 3 hot vampire women.
Right.
Do they do anything? Do they have names? No, we don't give my names either, because I contacted somebody and asked them, why are there no names for these characters? They was told, I don't know. So I kept them nameless, but I wanted them to have something to do.
Okay.
It doesn't change the flow of the narration too much.
Sure.
I did want to just make it so the women had their own voices and were their own personalities, but trying to keep the aesthetic of who they were the same.
Right.
Like one person from America, the other 2 are from England. Also the biggest thing that does change, I'm sorry, there is something, is Lucy has to choose like a suitor. Like the 3 guys that show up, Jack Stewart and Quincy Morris, Arthur Homewood, they're suitors for Lucy, and she picks one, right?
Right.
And she's going to marry that guy. And then she gets killed and turned into a vampire. And then they go with Van Helsing to go hunt her down. Lucy character is already engaged. There's no like choosing. There's no suitor or suitor 1, suitor 2. You know, there's none of that.
Okay.
Yeah. There's just they're engaged, and these are all friends. All
right. And I think you mentioned earlier that this was just released a couple of weeks ago.
The comic book prequel was released the 12th? The comic book prequel was released on Halloween weekend.
Okay.
The graphic novel was released this past March this year.
Very cool. And so what are your future plans with this? Is this a standalone story, or that sounded like you had other things in mind?
The prequel comic book is also a sequel comic book because we put a footnote in there. See Vlada, the Dracula tale, because it opens up with the remaining character of Vlada's entourage telling the story of Vlada's origin.
Okay. What about is there anything to follow the graphic novel?
That would be the spinoff I mentioned, Colleen, the vampire, in 2023.
Okay. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, or is it too early?
Not really. No? Not yet. Because we're still 2 years. We're still quite a ways away from it.
Okay.
And that script hasn't even started yet.
All right.
But I have an idea. I have an outline of what's going to happen in it.
Okay.
Including something, I swear to God, I have watched as many vampire movies as I possibly could. I've watched every episode of What You Do in the Shadows, Forever Night, the Vampire Diaries, all those terrible Twilight movies, and I've seen a ton of anime vampire stuff. Right. I've seen some pornography vampire stuff, and I'm going to put something in a vampire novel. I swear to God, I have researched, and I don't think has ever been done before.
I assume then you've watched Midnight Mass as well.
Yes.
Okay.
On Netflix?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Because that's the most recent one that I've watched. So, and that was quite an impressive effort by Mr. Flanagan again.
Yeah. There's no dead cats in ours washing up on shore.
Okay.
No. We're going to do something in the book. I swear I'm going to keep an eye on the vampire community to see if it gets done. And if it's been done in like a trauma movie, that's one thing.
Right.
But I'm really going to be. I'm gonna do something in a vampire story. I swear I don't think has been done before.
Okay. And your books are all available on Amazon and all the other expected outlets?
Vlada is available on Amazon. A children's book I did years ago is available on Amazon. The audiobook I need to get up on Audible. I have not yet. Okay. The audiobook came out over the summer. I need to get it on Audible. It's available on my Etsy. Basically, you just go to Etsy and then you can click on it. You want to buy it and then it sends it right to you.
Okay.
But the Audible service, I need to get Vlada on there. So I'm working on that.
Okay. And where can you best be reached at?
For Vlada, they can reach out on the Facebook page, Vlada Dracula too. Oh, I don't know my own Facebook page. Hold on. So it's a Facebook. Okay, so facebook.com, Vlada graphic novel. And then also on Twitter, Vlada_GN. And then also on Etsy. You just type in Vlada, a Dracula tale on Etsy. It should come right up.
Okay, very cool. I think that's all the questions I had. Is there anything that hasn't come up over the course of this chat that you'd like to mention at this time?
The short film I did, by the way, is on my YouTube under Radio of Horror.
Okay.
It's called Dracula's Guest. It's how the female Dracula meets the female Renfield.
Okay, very cool.
And it does tie into the whole story as it is because they reference the short film in the graphic novel. Not go see the graphic novel, go see the short film, as a footnote. But it's you get the idea of like, oh, that short film I watched, that's what they're talking about in the graphic novel. But if you didn't watch the short film, it's not a big deal because Renfield is just kind of like already crazy by the time you get to the story anyway.
Okay.
So, and our Renfield is really just there to be annoying and then gets killed.
A red shirt. All right. Very good. Okay. Anything else?
No.
No. All right.
I can't think else.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, and I wish you all the best with this and your future projects. And take care.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.